Hi, this is Judy Knowles Saunders. This is for CM231 for our book summary. This is on rescuing Jesus, how people of color, women, and queer Christians are reclaiming evangelicalism. The book was published in November of 2015. The author is Deborah Jean Lee. She is a journalist and radio producer, not the typical profession of someone writing a book regarding Christianity or Christian culture, but uh, she's a former reporter. She's written for some pretty significant uh, platforms, Associated Press, being one. She taught journalism at Columbia, but a very well written book. I would recommend anyone who is in ministry in some form of fashion. Her perspective here is one that is valuable, definitely one that proves to be beneficial for all of us as we work towards being more contextually aware and serving in our faith communities. I want to apologize for the mode of the presentation. I've had technical troubles, so I am recording this in a different way in hopes that I will not have as much trouble uploading the video. So I am going to provide this document as an attachment to my video post. I'm not going to go over all of the bullets because there's not time for that, but this is just one of the things that I really enjoyed out of each chapter. So the book is broken up into three parts, each part consisting of three chapters. So part one, Conformist, we see in chapter one titled Assimilate to Survive. This is where stories of biracial Americans working to assimilate to white culture and to white theology. Now, the author, Lee, he speaks of how challenging the white perspectives within evangelical circles was really met with a lot of resistance, referencing back to some of the stories that she shares in the book. One of them is Lisa. But I thought that this quote that she shared was significant, but it's on page 27. It says, they found that historic patterns of inequality between white and black evangelicals continue to play out today, even though the groups share many faith principles and evangelical heritage. Why? Because of the starkly different ways black and white evangelicals interpret the world. And so I think that her quote there really sums up not only the gap, the racial divide, the gap between those different communities, but also in the space that we try to fill as biracial Americans to really assimilate to that white culture, to really buy into the white theology and not call it a riff. Now, chapter two, called Good Christian Girls, this chapter really focuses on the stories of those who were a victim of unhealthy gender expectations that pushed in conservative evangelicalism. Again, a couple of different stories from a couple of different folks in here, but one of the things that really struck me was Lisa and Nancy. So they were leaders of a feminist movement that started in the late 1960s. They collaborated together on a book called All We're Meant to Be. And in this book, they really argue that a contextualized reading of the Bible, we apply due diligence in our exegetical work, that we'll see that the Bible actually dismantles hierarchies, that it doesn't polarize gender roles in the way that we have done so on the societal construct. But there's a lot of good discussion in here, a lot of vulnerability by those sharing their stories, how impactful, although mostly negative. Those gender expectations were those theologically rooted assumptions that get pushed often in evangelical communities of faith, that males carry the authority and a female's role is to be subordinate. Chapter 3, titled Safety. This chapter shares stories of evangelicals, queer evangelicals that have stayed in the closet primarily because they fear being ostracized by a community that they find themselves very attached to. Um, where this doesn't come as much as a surprise, but in evangelical communities, it is widely or historically, the stance has widely been that homosexuality is a sin. Um, thought this was an interesting tidbit in there. So Lee talks about how we often associate the beginning of culture wars with the pro-life kind of anti-abortion movement, but it was actually a Supreme Court case where yeah, there was a university that didn't want to be, they didn't want to hire anyone who was openly sexual. They wanted to, um, forbid certain behaviors that they felt were acceptable in a racial marriage. There was all kinds of but the IRS actually attempted to revoke the taxes themselves because the school um, had such stringent rules and that they found to be exclusive and discriminative. So the school ended up fighting back. The appeal went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of the IRS. So this was, as historians, as the religious right leaders, she says, themselves would say this point here was actually the beginning of the culture. So moving into part two, that's looking at chapter 4, titled Racial Awakening. So chapter shares stories of folks who were advocating for multi-ethnic ministry despite previous efforts. There was a history of those attempts being stymied. She talks significantly about the role of white evangelicals in not only participating in and perpetuating, but relying on systemic racism in the way that they built their community. But towards the end of the chapter, she does offer a good bit of hope. We're seeing new multi-ethnic initiatives in the evangelical world that are really trying to tackle the oppressive structure that has long existed in white evangelicalism, specifically through intentional advocacy. So moving into chapter 5, uh, titled Submit No More. This chapter shares stories that discuss the danger of purity culture and the toxicity that it impresses upon women within the faith community. Um, One of the things that I found interesting in here was the Evangelical Women's Caucus. So, although it started earlier, the caucus in the mid 1980s uh, actually kind of divided on the issue of homosexuality. Actually led to kind of a split in the group, really. But there was actually progressive women within the EWC that were meeting privately. They called it lesbian and friends gatherings. Uh, they drafted several resolutions that they put before. None of them were put through, but it was really, a significant part of moving forward and to progress forward in the way that we view patriarchy. But that's really very. Then moving into chapter 6, titled Coming Out, as the title may imply. This shares stories of queer Christians who are coming out and beginning to form advocacy and support groups. Students really found solace and comfort in joining together to form community, feeling accepted, were heard and seen, and had a safe space to be able to be themselves. One of the things that I found most interesting about this was the role of some psychological research that was done during the 1960s. Although it was later discredited, this research stated that homosexuality was actually a disorder that's characterized by disturbed and psychopathic interactions. And the evangelical community took the standpoint that homosexuality was caused or linked to traumatic. Um, Obviously, research later came out that showed all of that to be not only false, but they moved forward with removing homosexuality as a formal diagnosis in the 1980s. I do think for the mention is mentioning here, he speaks of like our present day culture war 2.0. And mind you, the book was published 10 years ago. So I think we've kind of progressed into those cultural wars and we've kind of mutated a bit since then. But um, really, she notates that there's really become three groups. You have your progressive faction that's really begun to strengthen. Conservatives really dug their heels in and are really being resistant to any change. For those of you in the UMC, I think that those these three groups really reflect the transitions that we've recently gone through the last couple of years. And then the third group is just those caught in the middle, which I think is a natural place for some folks to go, just wrestling with mixed feelings about it, especially those who really grew up in this evangelical movement, who did view and were taught from a young age that homosexuality was a sin, but now beginning to do some wrestling of their own with this scripture. Moving into part 3, the radicals, chapter 7 is titled Made in the Image of God. Now this chapter really focuses on stories of evangelicals of color, their effort to advocate to be heard, kind of at the executive level of church leadership. They wanted to be more prominent about taking up space at conferences, being able to speak on the main stage, but also tackling teaching white evangelicals that systemic racial injustice is alive. It is it is thriving, unfortunately. But Lee makes the point that bridging this gap that has existed for so long is really going to require dramatic theological paradigm shift. And while we are doing our best to move that needle to create a more inclusive space, that there's still a lot of work left to go. She does spend a good bit of time talking about immigration policy in this chapter. I won't flesh that out too much, but I do think that her quote kind of speaks to the point she's trying to make. It's found on page 183. While millennials are walking out the front door of U.S. congregations, immigrant Christian communities are appearing right around the corner and sometimes knocking on the back door. Immigrants may hold the key to vitality for American Christianity. We're seeing immigrant Christian communities make up most of the court across multiple times. But definitely from an evangelical standpoint, the growth that they're seeing is primarily from communities that some might argue would have normally been left out and spoken against. But there has, over the last 10, 15 years, been an effort to kind of change some of the verbiage, some of the language around immigration policy, because there was research that showed that young folks are leaving the church. We are seeing an increase in immigrant Christian communities, non-white Christian communities, as the growth. And if we want to see that growth continue, then it needs to be a good time and opportunity for us to change that. So chapter 8, titled Evangelical, really focuses on stories of women and allies fighting to deconstruct this embedded patriarchy that is prevalent in evangelical faith communities. These feminists are for a fight. We felt that this is a complicated group. These are women who come to accept complementarian theology as maybe a way to cope with this insistence of female submission and male authority. But that the patriarchy is so ingrained in the home and the church and the workspace and society as a whole. but especially at home and in the church, that a lot of women have lost their awareness of it. And then moving into chapter 9, final titled Pride, again, that's title stories of those in the queer community and allies, and how they are really beginning to use their voices in a more public, intentional way. Um, I guess I should point out that several of the stories that are shared, you see this same character. So she reveals bits and pieces of their story as you move throughout the chapters. And so one of the things that you really notice in this chapter is how the stories of some of those queer Christians that have been named in the beginning of the book, you see them begin um, to find strength within themselves to live authentically into who they are. They persisted, they continued to advocate, and they begin to build a community that supports each other. And there's a lot of hope in this chapter. Speaking of all the organizations that have added injustices regarding sexuality and sexual preference uh, into their agendas, that those advocates are becoming more prominent, really gaining traction. Again, a great book. I really enjoyed it. I highly recommend that if you have the time, maybe over Christmas break when it is less required reading, that you take a second to read Rescuing Jesus. Definitely feel more prepared, more equipped to do authentic ministry. Thank you.